The Day of the Triffids, by John Wyndham. Read by Samuel West. Chapter 1. The End Begins. When a day that you happen to know is Wednesday starts off by sounding like Sunday, there is something seriously wrong somewhere. I felt that from the moment I woke. And yet when I started functioning a little more sharply, I misgave. After all, the odds were that it was I who was wrong and not everyone else, though I did not see how that could be. I went on waiting, tinged with doubt. But presently I had my first bit of objective evidence. A distant clock struck what sounded to me just like 8. I listened hard and suspiciously. Soon another clock began, on a loud, decisive note. In a leisurely fashion it gave an indisputable 8. Then I knew things were awry. The way I came to miss the end of the world, well, the end of the world I had known for close on 30 years, was sheer accident, like a lot of survival when you come to think of it. In the nature of things, a good many somebodies are always in hospital, and the law of averages had picked on me to be one of them a week or so before. It might just as easily have been the week before that, in which case I'd not be writing now. I'd not be here at all. But chance played it not only that I should be in hospital at that particular time, but that my eyes, and indeed my whole head, should be wreathed in bandages, and that's why I have to be grateful to whoever orders these averages. At the time, however, I was only peevish, wondering what in thunder went on, for I'd been in this place long enough to know that next to the matron, the clock is the most sacred thing in a hospital. Without a clock, the place simply couldn't latch. Each second there's someone consulting it on births, deaths, doses, meals, lights, talking, working, sleeping, resting, visiting, dressing, washing. And hitherto it had decreed that someone should begin to wash and tidy me up at exactly 3 minutes after 7 a.m. That was one of the best reasons I had for appreciating a private room. In a public ward, the messy proceeding would have taken place a whole unnecessary hour earlier. But here, today, clocks of varying reliability were continuing to strike 8 in all directions, and still nobody had shown up. Much as I disliked the sponging process, and useless as it had been to suggest that the help of a guiding hand as far as the bathroom could eliminate it, its failure to occur was highly disconcerting. Besides, it was normally a close forerunner of breakfast, and I was feeling hungry. Probably I would have been aggrieved about it any morning, but today, this Wednesday the 8th of May, was an occasion of particular personal importance. I was doubly anxious to get all the fuss and routine over, because that was the day they were going to take off my bandages. I groped around a bit to find the bell push and let them have a full 5 seconds clatter just to show what I was thinking of them. While I was waiting for the pretty short-tempered response that such appeal ought to bring, I went on listening. The day outside, I realized now, was sounding even more wrong than I had thought. The noises it made, or failed to make, were more like Sunday than Sunday itself. And I'd come round again to being absolutely assured that it was Wednesday, whatever else had happened to it. Why the founders of St. Mary's Hospital chose to erect their institution at a main road crossing upon a valuable office site, and thus expose their patients' nerves to constant laceration, is a foible that I never properly understood. But for those fortunate enough to be suffering from complaints unaffected by the wear and tear of continuous traffic, it did have the advantage that one could lie abed and still not be out of touch, so to speak, with the flow of life. Customarily, the westbound buses thundered along, trying to beat the lights at the corner. As often as not, a pig squeal of brakes and a salvo of shots from the silencer would tell that they hadn't. Then the released cross-traffic would rev and roar as it started up the incline. And every now and then there would be an interlude, a good grinding bump followed by a general stoppage, exceedingly tantalizing to one in my condition, where the extent of the contretemps had to be judged entirely by the degree of profanity resulting. Certainly, neither by day nor during most of the night was there any chance of a St. Merrin patient being under the impression that the common round had stopped just because he, personally, was on the shelf for the moment. But this morning was different. Disturbingly, because mysteriously different. No wheels rumbled, no buses roared, no sound of a car of any kind, in fact, was to be heard. No brakes, no horns, not even the clopping of the few rare horses that still occasionally passed. Nor, as there should be at such an hour, the composite tramp of work-bound feet. The more I listened, the queerer it seemed, and the less I cared for it. In what I reckoned to be 10 minutes of careful listening, I heard 5 sets of shuffling, hesitating footsteps, 3 voices bawling unintelligibly in the distance, and the hysterical sobs of a woman. There was not the cooing of a pigeon, nor the chirp of a sparrow. Nothing but the humming of wires in the wind. A nasty, empty feeling began to crawl up inside me. It was the same sensation I used to have sometimes as a child when I got to fancying that horrors were lurking in the shadowy corners of the bedroom. When I daren't put a foot out for fear that something should reach from under the bed and grab my ankle. Daren't even reach for the switch lest the movement should cause something to leap at me. I had to fight down the feeling just as I had to when I was a kid in the dark. And it was no easier. It's surprising how much you don't grow out of when it comes to the test. The elemental fears were still marching along with me, waiting their chance, and pretty nearly getting it, just because my eyes were bandaged, and the traffic had stopped. When I had pulled myself together a bit, I tried the reasonable approach. Why does traffic stop? Well, usually because the road is closed for repair. It's perfectly simple. Any time now they'd be along with pneumatic drills as another touch of oral variety for the long-suffering patients. But the trouble with the reasonable line was that it went further. It pointed out that there was not even the distant hum of traffic, nor the whistle of a train, nor the hoot of a tugboat. Just nothing. Until the clocks began chiming 8:15. The temptation to take a peep, not more than a peep, of course, just enough to get some idea of what on earth could be happening, was immense. But I restrained it. For one thing, a peep was a far less simple matter than it sounded. It wasn't just a case of lifting a blindfold. There were lots of pads and bandages. But, more importantly, I was scared to try. Over a week's complete blindness can do a lot to frighten you out of taking chances with your sight. It was true that they intended to remove the bandages today, but that would be done in a special dim light, and they would only allow them to stay off if the inspection of my eyes was satisfactory. I did not know whether it would be. It might be that my sight was permanently impaired, or that I would not be able to see at all. I did not know yet. I swore and laid hold of the bell push again. It helped to relieve my feelings a bit. No one, it seemed, was interested in bells. I began to get as much annoyed as worried. It's humiliating to be dependent anyway, but it's a still poorer pass to have no one to depend on. My patience was whittling down. Something, I decided, had got to be done about it. If I were to bawl down the passage and generally raise hell, somebody ought to show up, if only to tell me what they thought of me. I turned back the sheet and got out of bed. I'd never seen the room I was in, and though I had a fairly good idea by ear of the position of the door, it wasn't all that easy to find. There seemed to be several puzzling and unnecessary obstacles, but I got across at the cost of a stubbed toe and minor damage to my shin. I shoved my head out into the passage. "Hey!" I shouted. "I want some breakfast! Room 48! For a moment, nothing happened. Then came voices, all shouting together. It sounded like hundreds of them, and not a word coming through clearly. It was as though I'd put on a record of crowd noises, and an ill-disposed crowd at that. I had a nightmarish flash wondering whether I'd been transferred to a mental home while I was sleeping, and this was not St. Mary's Hospital at all. Those voices simply didn't sound normal to me. I closed the door hurriedly on the Babel and groped my way back to bed. At that moment bed seemed to be the one safe, comforting thing in my whole baffling environment. As if to underline that, there came a sound which checked me in the act of pulling up the sheets. From the street below rose a scream, wildly distraught and contagiously terrifying. It came 3 times, and when it had died away, it seemed still to tingle in the air. I shuddered. I could feel the sweat prickle my forehead under the bandages. I knew now that something fearful and horrible was happening. I could not stand my isolation and helplessness any longer. I had to know what was going on around me. I put my hands up to my bandages. Then, with my fingers on the safety pins, I stopped. Suppose the treatment had not been successful? Suppose that when I took the bandages off, I were to find that I still could not see? That would be worse still, 100 times worse. I lacked the courage to be alone and find out that they had not saved my sight. And even if they had, would it be safe yet to keep my eyes uncovered? I dropped my hands and lay back. I was wild at myself and the place, and I did some silly, weak cursing. Some little while must have passed before I got a proper hold on things again. But after a bit, I found myself churning round in my mind once more after a possible explanation. I did not find it. But I did become absolutely convinced that, come all the paradoxes of hell, it was Wednesday. For the previous day had been notable, and I could swear that no more than a single night had passed since then. You'll find it in the records that on Tuesday the 7th of May, the Earth's orbit passed through a cloud of comet debris. You can even believe it, if you like. Millions did. Maybe it was so. I can't prove anything either way. I was in no state to see what happened. But I do have my own ideas. All that I actually know of the occasion is that I had to spend the evening in my bed listening to eyewitness accounts of what was constantly claimed to be the most remarkable celestial spectacle on record. And yet, until the thing actually began, nobody had ever heard a word about this supposed comet, or its debris. Why they broadcast it, considering that everyone who could walk, hobble, or be carried was either out of doors or at windows enjoying the greatest free firework display ever, I don't know. But they did, and it helped to impress on me still more heavily what it meant to be sightless. I got round to feeling that if the treatment had not been successful, I'd rather end the whole thing than go on that way. It was reported in the news bulletins during the day that mysterious bright green flashes had been seen in the Californian skies the previous night. However, such a lot of things did happen in California that no one could be expected to get greatly worked up over that. But as further reports came in, this comet debris motif made its appearance, and it stuck. Accounts arrived from all over the Pacific of a night made brilliant by green meteors, said to be sometimes in such numerous showers that the whole sky appeared to be wheeling about us. And so it was, when you come to think of it. As the night line moved westward, the brilliance of the display was in no way decreased. Occasional green flashes became visible even before darkness fell. The announcer giving an account of the phenomenon in the 6 o'clock news advised everyone that it was an amazing scene, and one not to be missed. He mentioned also that it seemed to be interfering seriously with shortwave reception at long distances, but that the medium waves on which there would be a running commentary were unaffected, as, at present, was television. He need not have troubled with the advice. By the way everyone in the hospital got excited about it, it seemed to me that there was not the least likelihood of anybody missing it. Except myself. And as if the radio's comments were not enough, the nurse who brought me my supper had to tell me all about it. "The sky's simply full of shooting stars," she said. "All bright green, they make people's faces look frightfully ghastly. Everybody's out there watching them, and sometimes it's almost as light as day, only all the wrong colour. Every now and then there's a big one so bright that it hurts to look at it. It's a marvellous sight. They say there's never been anything like it before. It's such a pity you can't see it, isn't it?" "It is," I agreed, somewhat shortly. "We've drawn back the curtains in the ward so they can all see it," she went on. "If only you hadn't those bandages, you'd have a wonderful view of it from here." "Oh," I said. "But it must be better still outside, though. They say thousands of people are out in the parks and on the heath watching it all, and on all the flat roofs you can see people standing and looking up." "How long do they expect it to go on?" I asked patiently. "I don't know, but they say it's not so bright now as it was in other places. Still, even if you had your bandages off today, I don't expect they'd have let you watch it. You'll have to take things gently at first, and some of the flashes are very bright. They— Ooh!" "Why, ooh?" I inquired. That was such a brilliant one then. It made the whole room look green. What a pity you couldn't see it. Isn't it? I agreed. Now do go away, there's a good girl. I tried listening to the radio, but it was making the same oohs and ahs, helped out by gentlemanly tones which blathered about this magnificent spectacle and unique phenomenon, until I began to feel that there was a party for all the world going on with me as the only person not invited. I didn't have any choice of entertainment, for the hospital radio system gave only one program, take it or leave it. After a bit, I gathered that the show had begun to wane. The announcer advised everyone who had not yet seen it to hurry up and do so, or regret all his life that he had missed it. The general idea seemed to be to convince me that I was passing up the very thing I was born for. In the end, I got sick of it and switched off. The last thing I heard was that the display was diminishing fast now, and that we'd probably be out of the debris area in a few hours. There could be no doubt in my mind that all this had taken place the previous evening. For one thing, I should have been a great deal hungrier even than I was, had it been longer ago. Very well. What was this, then? Had the whole hospital, the whole city, made such a night of it that they'd not pulled round yet? About which point I was interrupted as the chorus of clocks, near and far, started announcing 9. For the third time I played hell with the bell. As I lay waiting, I could hear a sort of murmurousness beyond the door. It seemed composed of whimperings, slitherings, and shufflings, punctuated occasionally by a raised voice in the distance. But still, no one came to my room. By this time I was slipping back. The nasty childish fancies were on me again. I found myself waiting for the unseeable door to open and horrible things to come padding in. In fact, I wasn't perfectly sure that somebody or something wasn't in already and stealthily prowling round the room. Not that I'm given to that kind of thing, really. It was those damned bandages over my eyes, the medley of voices that had shouted back at me down the corridor. But I certainly was getting the willies. And once you get 'em, they grow. Already they were past the stage where you can shoo them off by whistling or singing at yourself. It came at last to the straight question. Was I more scared of endangering my sight by taking off the bandages, or of staying in the dark with the willies growing every minute? If it had been a day or two earlier, I don't know what I'd have done. Very likely the same in the end. But this day I could at least tell myself, well, hang it, there can't be a lot of harm if I use common sense. After all, the bandages are due to come off today. I'll risk it. There's one thing I put to my credit. I was not far enough gone to tear them off wildly. I had the sense and the self-control to get out of bed and pull the blind down before I started on the safety pins. Once I had the coverings off, and had found out that I could see in the dimness, I felt a relief that I'd never known before. Nevertheless, the first thing I did after assuring myself that there were indeed no malicious persons or things lurking under the bed or elsewhere, was to slip a chair back under the door handle. I could and did begin to get a better grip on myself then. I made myself take a whole hour, gradually getting used to full daylight. At the end of it, I knew that thanks to swift first aid, followed by good doctoring, my eyes were as good as ever. But still, no one came. On the lower shelf of the bedside table I discovered a pair of dark glasses thoughtfully put ready against my need of them. Cautiously I put them on before I went right close to the window. The lower part of it was not made to open, so that the view was restricted. Squinting down and sideways, I could see one or two people who appeared to be wandering in an odd, kind of aimless way farther up the street. But what struck me most, and at once, was the sharpness, the clear definition of everything, even the distant housetops' view across the opposite roofs. And then I noticed that no chimney, large or small, was smoking. I found my clothes hung tidily in a cupboard. I began to feel more normal once I had them on. There were some cigarettes still in the case. I lit one, and started to get into the state of mind where, though everything was still undeniably queer, I could no longer understand why I had been quite so near panic. It is not easy to think oneself back to the outlook of those days. We have to be more self-reliant now. But then there was so much routine. Things were so interlinked. Each one of us so steadily did his little part in the right place that it was easy to mistake habit and custom for the natural law. And all the more disturbing, therefore, when the routine was in any way upset. When getting on for half a lifetime has been spent in one conception of order, reorientation is no 5-minute business. Looking back at the shape of things then, the amount we did not know and did not care to know about our daily lives is not only astonishing, but somehow a bit shocking. I knew practically nothing, for instance, of such ordinary things as how my food reached me, where the fresh water came from, how the clothes I wore were woven and made, how the drainage of cities kept them healthy. Our life had become a complexity of specialists, all attending to their own jobs with more or less efficiency, and expecting others to do the same. That made it incredible to me, therefore, that complete disorganization could have overtaken the hospital. Somebody, somewhere, I was sure, must have it in hand. Unfortunately, it was a somebody who had forgotten all about room 48. Nevertheless, when I did go to the door again and peer into the corridor, I was forced to realize that whatever had happened, it was affecting a great deal more than the single inhabitant of room 48. Just then, there was no one in sight, though in the distance I could hear a pervasive murmur of voices. There was a sound of shuffling footsteps, too, and occasionally a louder voice echoing hollowly in the corridors, but nothing like the din I had shut out before. This time, I did not shout. I stepped out cautiously. Why cautiously? I don't know. There was just something that induced it. It was difficult in that reverberating building to tell where the sounds were coming from, but one way the passage finished at an obscured French window, with the shadow of a balcony rail upon it, so I went the other. Rounding a corner, I found myself out of the private room wing, and on a broader corridor. When I first looked along it, I thought it empty. Then as I moved forward, I saw a figure come out of a shadow. He was a man wearing a black jacket and striped trousers, with a white cotton coat over them. I judged him to be one of the staff doctors, but it was curious that he should be crouching against the wall and feeling his way along. "Hello there," I said. He stopped suddenly. The face he turned towards me was grey and frightened. "Who are you?" he asked uncertainly. "My name's Masen," I told him. "William Masen. I'm a patient, room 48, and I've come to find out what—" "You can see?" he interrupted swiftly. "Certainly I can, just as well as ever," I assured him. "It's a wonderful job. Nobody came to unbandage my eyes, so I did it myself. I don't think there's any harm done. I took—" But he interrupted again. "Please take me to my office. I must telephone at once." I was slow to catch on, but everything ever since I woke that morning had been bewildering. "Where's that?" I asked. "5th floor, west wing. The name's on the door, Dr. Soames." "All right," I agreed in some surprise. "Where are we now?" The man rocked his head from side to side, his face tense and exasperated. "How the hell should I know?" he said bitterly. "You've got eyes, damn it, use them! Can't you see I'm blind?" There was nothing to show that he was blind. His eyes were wide open, and apparently looking straight at me. "Wait here a minute," I said. I looked round. I found a large 5 painted on the wall opposite the lift gate. I went back and told him. "Good. Take my arm," he directed. "You turn right as you come out of the lift, then take the first passage on the left, and it's the 3rd door." I followed instructions. We met no one at all on the way. Inside the room I led him up to the desk and handed him the telephone. He listened for some moments. Then he groped about until he found the rest, and rattled the bar impatiently. Slowly his expression changed. The irritability and the harassed lines faded away. He looked simply tired. Very tired. He put the receiver down on the desk. For some seconds he stood silently, looking as though he was staring at the wall opposite. Then he turned. "It's useless. Dead. You are still here," he added. "Yes," I told him. His fingers felt along the edge of the desk. Which way am I facing? Where's the damned window?" he demanded with a return of irritability. "It's right behind you," I said. He turned and stepped towards it, both hands extended. He felt the sill and the sides carefully, and stepped back a pace. Before I had realized what he was doing, he had launched himself full at it, and crashed through. I didn't look to see. After all, it was the 5th floor. When I moved, it was to sit down heavily in the chair. I took a cigarette from a box on the desk and lit it shakily. I sat here for some minutes while I steadied up, and let the sick feeling subside. After a while it did. I left the room and went back to the place where I had first found him. I still wasn't feeling too good when I got there. At the far end of the wide corridor were the doors of a ward. The panels were frosted save for ovals of clear glass at face level. I reckoned there ought to be someone on duty there that I could report to about the doctor. I opened the door. It was pretty dark in there. The curtains had evidently been drawn after the previous night's display was over, and they were still drawn. "Sister?" I inquired.
"She ain't here,"
a man's voice said.
"What's more,"
it went on,
"she ain't been here for ruddy hours, neither. Can't you pull them ruddy curtains, mate? Let's have some flipping light. Don't know what's come out of the bloody place this morning."
"Okay," I agreed. Even if the whole place were disorganized, it didn't seem to be any good reason why the unfortunate patients should have to lie in the dark. I pulled back the curtains on the nearest window and let in a shaft of bright sunlight. It was a surgical ward with about 20 patients, all bedridden. Leg injuries mostly. Several amputations by the look of it.
"Stop fooling about with them, mate, and pull 'em back,"
said the same voice. I turned and looked at the man who spoke. He was a dark, burly fellow with a weather-beaten skin. He was sitting up in bed facing directly at me, and at the light. His eyes seemed to be gazing into my own. So did his neighbours, and the next man's. For a few moments I stared back at them. It took that long to register. Then,
They seem to be stuck,"
I said.
"I'll find someone to see to them."
And with that I fled the ward. I was shaky again, and I could have done with a stiff drink. The thing was beginning to sink in, but I found it difficult to believe that all the men in that ward could be blind, just like the doctor. And yet... The lift wasn't working, so I started down the stairs. On the next floor I pulled myself together and plucked up the courage to look into another ward. The beds there were all disarranged. At first I thought the place was empty, but it wasn't. Not quite. 2 men in nightclothes lay on the floor. One was soaked in blood from an unhealed incision. The other looked as if some kind of congestion had seized him. They were both quite dead. The rest had gone. Back on the stairs once more, I realized that most of the background voices I had been hearing all the time were coming up from below, and that they were louder and closer now. I hesitated a moment, but there seemed to be nothing for it but to go on making my way down. On the next turn, I nearly tripped over a man who lay across my way in the shadow. At the bottom of the flight lay somebody who actually had tripped over him, and cracked his head on the stone steps as he landed. At last I reached the final turn, where I could stand and look down into the main hall. Seemingly everyone in the place who was able to move must have made instinctively for that spot, either with the idea of finding help, or of getting outside. Perhaps some of them had got out. One of the main entrance doors was wide open, but most of them couldn't find it. There was a tight-packed mob of men and women, nearly all of them in their hospital nightclothes, milling slowly and helplessly around. The motion pressed those on the outskirts cruelly against marble corners or ornamental projections, Some of them were crushed breathlessly against the walls. Now and then one would trip. If the press of bodies allowed him to fall, there was little chance that it would let him come up again. The place looked... well, you'll have seen some of Dore's pictures of sinners in hell. But Dore couldn't include the sounds, the sobbing, the murmurous moaning, and occasionally a forlorn cry. A minute or two of it was all I could stand. I fled back up the stairs. There was the feeling that I ought to do something about it. Lead them out into the street, perhaps, and at least put an end to that dreadful slow milling. But a glance had been enough to show that I could not hope to make my way to the door to guide them down there. Besides, if I did get them outside, what then? I sat down on a step for a while to get over it, with my head in my hands and that awful conglomerate sound in my ears all the time. Then I searched for and found another staircase. It was a narrow service flight, which led me out by a back way into the yard. Maybe I'm not telling this part too well. The whole thing was so unexpected and shocking that for a time I deliberately tried not to remember the details. Just then I was feeling much as though it were a nightmare from which I was desperately but vainly seeking the relief of waking myself. As I stepped out into the yard, I still half refused to believe what I had seen. But one thing I was perfectly certain about. Reality or nightmare, I needed a drink, as I had seldom needed one before. There was nobody in sight in the little side street outside the yard gates, but almost opposite stood a pub. I can recall its name now, the Alamein Arms. There was a board bearing a reputed likeness of Viscount Montgomery hanging from an iron bracket, and below one of the doors stood open. I made straight for it. Stepping into the public bar gave me, for the moment, a comforting sense of normality. It was prosaically and familiarly like dozens of others. But although there was no one in that part, there was certainly something going on in the saloon bar round the corner. I heard heavy breathing. A cork left its bottle with a pop. A pause. Then a voice remarked, "Gin! Blast the hell with gin!" There followed a shattering crash. The voice gave a sozzled chuckle. "That's the mirror. What's the good of mirrors, anyway?" Another cork popped. "It's damn gin again!" complained the voice, offended. "The hell with gin!" This time the bottle hit something soft, thudded to the floor, and lay there gurgling away its contents. "Hey!" I called. "I want a drink." There was a silence. Then, "Who are you?" the voice inquired cautiously. "I'm from the hospital," I said. "I want a drink." "Don't remember your voice. Can you see?" "Yes," I told him. "Well, for God's sake, get over the bar dock and find me a bottle of whiskey." "I'm doctor enough for that," I said. I climbed across and went round the corner. A large-bellied, red-faced man with a greying walrus moustache stood there, clad only in trousers and a collarless shirt. He was fairly drunk. He seemed undecided whether to open the bottle he held in his hand or to use it as a weapon. "If you're not a doctor, what are you?" he demanded suspiciously. "I was a patient, but I need a drink as much as any doctor," I said. "That's gin again you've got there," I added. "Oh, is it? Bugger gin," he said, and slung it away. It went through the window with a lively crash. "Give me that corkscrew," I told him. I took down a bottle of whiskey from the shelf, opened it, and handed it to him with a glass. For myself, I chose a stiff brandy with very little soda, and then another. After that, my hand wasn't shaking so much. I looked at my companion. He was taking his whiskey neat out of the bottle. "You'll get drunk," I said. He paused and turned his head towards me. I could have sworn that his eyes really saw me. "Get drunk? Damn it, I am drunk," he said scornfully. He was so perfectly right that I didn't comment. He brooded a moment before he announced, "Gonna get drunker.
Gonna get much drunker.
He leaned closer.
Do you know what? I'm blind. That's what I am. Blind as a bat. Everybody's blind as a bat. Except you. Why aren't you blind as a bat?
I don't know, I told him.
It's that bloody comet bugger it. That's what done it. Green shooting stars, and now everybody's blind as a bat. Did you see green shooting stars?
No, I admitted.
There you are. Proves it. You didn't see them? You aren't blind. Everybody else saw them.
He waved an expressive arm.
All blind as bats. Bugger comets, I say.
I poured myself a third brandy, wondering whether there might not be something in what he was saying. Everyone blind? I repeated.
That's it. All of them. Probably everyone in the world.
Except you, he added, as an afterthought. How do you know? I asked.
It's easy. Listen,
he said. We stood side by side, leaning on the bar of the dingy pub, and listened. There was nothing to be heard. Nothing but the rustle of a dirty newspaper blown down the empty street. Such a quietness held everything as cannot have been known in those parts for 1,000 years and more.
See what I mean? It's obvious, said the man.
Yes, I said slowly. Yes, I see what you mean. I decided that I must get along. I did not know where to, but I must find out more about what was happening. Are you the landlord? I asked him.
What if I am?
He demanded defensively. Only that I've got to pay someone for 3 double brandies.
Forget it. But look here, forget it, I tell you. Do you know why? Because what's the good of money to a dead man? And that's what I am, as good as. Just a few more drinks.
He looked a pretty robust specimen for his age, and I said so.
What's the good of living blind as a bat?
He demanded aggressively.
That's what my wife said. And she was right. Only she's more guts than I have. When she found us the kids were blind too, what did she do? Took 'em into our bed with her and turned on the gas. That's what she done. And I hadn't the guts to stick with 'em. She's got pluck, my wife. More than I have. But I will have soon. I'm going back up there soon. When I'm drunk enough.
What was there to say? What I did say served no purpose save to spoil his temper. In the end he groped his way to the stairs and disappeared up them, bottle in hand. I didn't try to stop him, or follow him. I watched him go. Then I knocked back the last of my brandy, and went out into the silent street. Chapter 2. The Coming of the Triffids. This is a personal record. It involves a great deal that has vanished forever, but I can't tell it in any other way than by using the words we used to use for those vanished things. So they have to stand. But even to make the setting intelligible, I find that I shall have to go back farther than the point at which I started. When I was a child, we lived, my father, my mother, and myself, in a southern suburb of London. We had a small house which my father supported by conscientious daily attendance at his desk in Inland Revenue Department, and a small garden at which he worked rather harder during the summer. There was not a lot to distinguish us from the 10 or 12 million other people who used to live in and around London in those days. My father was one of those persons who could add a column of figures, even of the ridiculous coinage then in use locally, with a flick of the eye, so that it was natural for him to have in mind that I should become an accountant. As a result, my inability to make any column of figures reach the same total twice caused me to be something of a mystery as well as a disappointment to him. Still, there it was. Just one of those things. And each of a succession of teachers who tried to show me that mathematical answers were derived logically and not through some form of esoteric inspiration, was forced to give up, with the assurance that I had no head for figures. My father would read my school reports with a gloom which in other respects they scarcely warranted. His mind worked, I think, this way: no head for figures equals no idea of finance equals no money. "I really don't know what we shall do with you. What do you want to do?" he would ask. And until I was 13 or 14, I would shake my head, conscious of my sad inadequacy, and admit that I did not know. My father would then shake his head. For him the world was divided sharply into desk men who worked with their brains, and non-desk men who didn't and got dirty. How he contrived to maintain this view, which was already a century or so out of date, I do not know, but it pervaded my early years to such an extent that I was late in perceiving that a weakness in figures did not of necessity condemn me to the life of a street sweeper or a scullion. It did not occur to me that the subject which interested me most could lead to a career, and my father failed either to notice, or if he did, to care, that reports on my biology were consistently good. It was the appearance of the Triffids which really decided the matter for us. Indeed, they did a lot more than that for me. They provided me with a job, and comfortably supported me. They also, on several occasions, almost took my life. On the other hand, I have to admit that they preserved it, too, for it was a Triffid sting that had landed me in hospital on the critical occasion of the comet debris. In the books, there is quite a lot of loose speculation on the sudden occurrence of the Triffids. Most of it is nonsense. Certainly they were not spontaneously generated, as many simple souls believed. Nor did most people endorse the theory that they were a kind of sample visitation, harbingers of worse to come if the world did not mend its ways and behave its troublesome self. Nor did their seeds float to us through space, as specimens of the horrid forms life might assume upon other, less favoured worlds. At least, I am satisfied that they did not. I learned more about it than most people because Triffids were my job, and the firm I worked for was intimately, if not very gracefully, concerned in their public appearance. Nevertheless, their true origin still remains obscure. My own belief, for what it is worth, is that they were the outcome of a series of ingenious biological meddlings, and very likely accidental at that. Had they been evolved anywhere but in the region they were, we should doubtless have had a well-documented ancestry for them. As it was, no authoritative statement was ever published by those who must have been best qualified to know. The reason for this lay, no doubt, in the curious political conditions then prevailing. The world we lived in then was wide, and most of it was open to us with little trouble. Roads, railways, and shipping lines laced it, ready to carry one thousands of miles safely and in comfort. If we wanted to travel more swiftly still, and could afford it, we travelled by aeroplane. There was no need for anyone to take weapons or even precautions in those days. You could go just as you were to wherever you wished, with nothing to hinder you, other than a lot of forms and regulations. A world so tamed sounds utopian now. Nevertheless, it was so, over 5/6 of the globe, though the remaining sixth was something different again. It must be difficult for young people who never knew it to envisage a world like that. Perhaps it sounds like a golden age, though it wasn't quite that to those who lived in it. Or they may think that an earth ordered and cultivated almost all over sounds dull, but it wasn't that either. It was rather an exciting place, for a biologist anyway. Every year we were pushing the northern limit of growth for food plants a little further back. New fields were growing quick crops on what had historically been simply tundra or barren land. Every season, too, stretches of desert, both old and recent, were reclaimed and made to grow grass or food. For food was then our most pressing problem, and the progress of the regeneration schemes and the advance of the cultivation lines on the maps was followed with almost as much attention as an earlier generation had paid to battlefronts. Such a swerve of interest from swords to ploughshares was undoubtedly a social improvement, But at the same time, it was a mistake for the optimistic to claim it as showing a change in the human spirit. The human spirit continued much as before, 95% of it wanting to live in peace, and the other 5% considering its chances if it should risk starting anything. It was chiefly because no one's chances looked too good that the lull continued. Meanwhile, with something like 25 million new mouths bawling for food every year, the supply problem became steadily worse, and after years of ineffective propaganda, a couple of atrocious harvests had at last made the people aware of its urgency. The factor which had caused the militant 5% to relax a while from fermenting discord was the satellites. Sustained research in rocketry had at last succeeded in attaining one of its objectives. It had sent up a missile which stayed up. It was, in fact, possible to fire a rocket far enough up for it to fall into an orbit round the Earth. Once there, it would continue to circle like a tiny moon, quite inactive and innocuous, until the pressure on a button should give it the impulse to drop back, with devastating effect. Great as was the public concern which followed the triumphant announcement of the first nation to establish a satellite weapon satisfactorily, a still greater concern was felt over the failure of others to make any announcement at all, even when they were known to have had similar successes. It was by no means pleasant to realize that there was an unknown number of menaces up there over your head, quietly circling and circling until someone should arrange for them to drop, and that there was nothing to be done about them. Still, life has to go on, and novelty is a wonderfully short-lived thing. One became used to the idea perforce. From time to time there would be a panicky flare-up of expostulation when reports circulated that as well as satellites with atomic heads, there were others with such things as crop diseases, cattle diseases, radioactive dusts, viruses, and infections not only of familiar kinds, but brand-new sorts recently thought up in laboratories, all floating around up there. Whether such uncertain and potentially backfiring weapons had actually been placed is hard to say. But then the limits of folly itself, particularly of folly with fear on its heels, are not easy to define. A virulent organism, unstable enough to become harmless in the course of a few days, and who is to say that such could not be bred, could be considered to have strategic uses if dropped in suitable spots. At least the United States government took the suggestion seriously enough to deny emphatically that it controlled any satellites designed to conduct biological warfare directly upon human beings. One or two minor nations, whom no one suspected of controlling any satellites at all, hastened to make similar declarations. Other and major powers did not. In the face of this ominous reticence, the public began demanding to know why the United States had neglected to prepare for a form of warfare which others were ready to use, and just what did directly mean anyway. At this point, all parties tacitly gave up denying or confirming anything about satellites, and an intensified effort was made to divert the public interest to the no less important, but far less acrimonious matter of food scarcity. The laws of supply and demand should have enabled the more enterprising to organize commodity monopolies, but the world at large had become antagonistic to declared monopolies. However, the laced company system really worked very smoothly without anything so imputable as articles of federation. The general public heard scarcely anything of such little difficulties within the pattern as had to be untangled from time to time. Hardly anyone heard of even the existence of Umberto Cristoforo Palanjuez, for instance. I only heard of him myself years later in the course of my work. Umberto was of assorted Latin descent, and something South American by nationality. His first appearance as a possibly disruptive spanner in the neat machinery of the edible oil interests occurred when he walked into the offices of the Arctic and European Fish Oil Company and produced a bottle of pale pink oil in which he proposed to interest them. Arctic and European displayed no eagerness. The trade was pretty well tied up. However, they did in the course of time get around to analyzing the sample he had left with them. The first thing they discovered about it was that it was not a fish oil anyway. It was vegetable, though they could not identify the source. The second revelation was that it made most of their best fish oils look like greasebox fillers. Alarmed, they sent out what remained of the sample for intensive study, and put round hurried inquiries to know if Mr. Palanquez had made other approaches. When Umberto called again, the managing director received him with flattering attention. "That is a very remarkable oil you brought us, Mr. Palanquez," he said. Umberto nodded his sleek, dark head. He was well aware of the fact. "I have never seen anything quite like it," the managing director admitted. Umberto nodded again. "No," he said politely. Then, seemingly as an afterthought, he added, "But I think you will, senor. A very great deal of it." He appeared to ponder. "It will, I think, come on the market 7, maybe 8 years from now." He smiled. The managing director thought that unlikely. He said with a frank air, "It is better than our fish oils." "So I am told, senor," agreed Umberto. "You are proposing to market it yourself, Mr. Palanquez?" Umberto smiled again. "Would I be showing it to you if I did?" "We might reinforce one of our own oils synthetically," observed the managing director reflectively. "With some of the vitamins, but it would be costly to synthesize all of them, even if you could," Umberto said gently. "Besides," he added, "I am told that this oil will easily undersell your best fish oils anyway." Said the managing director. "Well, I suppose you have a proposition, Mr. Palanquez. Shall we come to it?" Umberto explained. "There are 2 ways of dealing with such an unfortunate matter. The usual one is to prevent it happening, or at least to delay it until the capital sunk in present equipment has been paid off. That is, of course, the desirable way." The managing director nodded. He knew plenty about that. "But this time I am so sorry for you because, you see, it is not possible." The managing director had his doubts. His inclination was to say, "You'd be surprised," but he resisted it and contented himself with a non-committal, "Oh?" "The other way," suggested Umberto, "is to produce the thing yourself before the trouble starts." "Ah," said the managing director. "I think," Umberto told him, "I think that I might be able to supply you with seeds of this plant in maybe 6 months' time. If you were to plant them, you could begin production of oil in 5 years, or it might be 6 for full yield." "Just nicely in time, in fact," observed the managing director. Umberto nodded. "The other way would be simpler," remarked the managing director. "If it were possible at all," Umberto agreed. "But, unfortunately, your competitors are not approachable, or suppressible." He made the statement with a confidence which caused the managing director to study him thoughtfully for some moments. "I see," he said at last. I wonder, you don't happen to be a Soviet citizen, Mr. Palanquez?" "No," said Umberto. "On the whole, my life has been lucky, but I have very varied connections." That brings us to considering the other 1/6 of the world, that part which one could not visit with such facility as the rest. Indeed, permits to visit the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were almost unobtainable, and the movements of those who did achieve them were strictly circumscribed. It had deliberately organized itself into a land of mystery. Little of what went on behind the veiling secrecy which was almost pathological in the region was known to the rest of the world. What was usually suspect. Yet behind the curious propaganda which distributed the laughable while concealing all likely to be of the least importance, achievements undoubtedly went on in many fields. One was biology. Russia, who shared with the rest of the world the problem of increasing food supplies, was known to have been intensively concerned with attempts to reclaim desert, steppe, and the northern tundra. In the days when information was still exchanged, she had reported some successes. Later, however, a cleavage of methods and views had caused biology there under a man called Lysenko to take a different course. It, too, then succumbed to the endemic secrecy. The lines it had taken were unknown and thought to be unsound, but it was anybody's guess whether very successful, very silly, or very queer things were happening there, if not all three at once. "Sunflowers," said the managing director, speaking absent-mindedly out of his own reflections. "I happen to know they were having another shot at improving the yield of sunflower seed oil, but it isn't that." "No," agreed Umberto. "It is not that." The managing director doodled. "Seeds, you said. Do you mean that it's some new species? Because if it is merely some improved strain more easily processed, I understand that it is a new species. Something quite new. Then you haven't actually seen it yourself. It may, in fact, be some modified kind of sunflower." "I have seen a picture, senor. I do not say there is no sunflower there at all. I do not say there is no turnip there. I do not say there is no nettle, or even no orchid there. But I do say that if they were all fathers to it, they would none of them know their child. I do not think it would please them greatly either." "I see. Now, what was this figure you had in mind for getting us the seeds of this thing?" Umberto named a sum which stopped the managing director's doodling quite abruptly. It made him take off his glasses to regard the speaker more closely. Umberto was unabashed. "Consider, senor," he said, ticking off points on his fingers. "It is difficult, and it is dangerous, very dangerous. I do not fear, but I do not go to danger to amuse myself. There is another man, a Russian. I shall have to bring him away, and he must be paid well. There will be others that he must pay first. Also, I must buy an aeroplane, a jet aeroplane, very fast. All these things cost money. And I tell you, it is not easy. You must have seeds that are good. Many of the seeds of this plant are infertile. To make sure, I have to bring you seeds that have been sorted. They are valuable. And in Russia, everything is a state secret and guarded. Certainly, it will not be easy." "Now, I believe that, but all the same—" "Is it so much, senor? What will you say in a few years when these Russians are selling their oil all over the world and your company is finished?" "It will need thinking over, Mr. Palanjuez." "But of course, senor," Umberto agreed with a smile. "I can wait. A little while. But I'm afraid I cannot reduce my price." Nor did he.
End of Disc 1. Disc 2.
The discoverer and the inventor are the bane of business. A little sand in the works is comparatively a mere nothing. You just replace the damaged parts and go on. But the appearance of a new process, a new substance when you are all organized and ticking nicely, is the very devil. Sometimes it is worse than that. It just cannot be allowed to occur. Too much is at stake. If you can't use legal methods, you must try others. For Umberto had understated the case. It was not simply that the competition of a cheap new oil would send Arctic and European and their associates out of business. The effects would be widespread. It might not be fatal to the groundnut, the olive, the whale, and a number of other oil industries, but it would be a nasty knock. Moreover, there would be violent repercussions in dependent industries, in margarine, soap, and 100 more products from face creams to house paints and beyond. Indeed, once a few of the more influential concerns had grasped the quality of the menace, Umberto's terms came to seem almost modest. He got his agreement, for his samples were convincing if the rest was somewhat vague. In point of fact, it cost those interested quite a lot less than they had undertaken to pay, for after Umberto went off with his aeroplane and his advance, he was never seen again. But that is not to say he was altogether unheard of. Some years later, an indeterminate individual giving simply the name Fedor turned up at the offices of Arctic and European Oils. They had dropped fish from both their title and activities then. He was, he said, a Russian, He would like, he said, some money, if the kind capitalists would be good enough to spare some. His story was that he had been employed in the first experimental Triffid station in the district of Elovsk, in Kamchatka. It was a forlorn place, and he greatly disliked it. His desire to get away had caused him to listen to a suggestion from another worker there, to be specific, on Tovarich Nikolai Alexandrovich Baltinov, and the suggestion had been backed up by several thousand rubles. It did not require a great deal of earning. He had simply to remove a box of sorted fertile Triffid seeds from its rack and substitute a similar box of infertile seeds. The purloined box was to be left at a certain place at a certain time. There was practically no risk. It might be years before the substitution was discovered. A further requirement, however, was a little more tricky. He was to see that a pattern of lights was laid out on a large field a mile or two from the plantation. He was to be there himself on a certain night. He would hear an aeroplane flying directly above. He would switch on the lights. The plane would land. The best thing he could do then would be to get away from the neighborhood as soon as possible before anyone should arrive to investigate. For these services he would receive not only the comfortable wad of rubles, but if he should succeed in leaving Russia, he would find more money waiting for him at the offices of Arctic and European in England. By his account, the operation had gone entirely to plan. Fedor had not waited once the plane was down. He had switched off the lights and beat it. The plane had stopped only a short time, perhaps not 10 minutes, before it took off again. From the sound of the jets, he judged that it was climbing steeply as it went. A minute or so after the noise had died away, he heard the sound of engines again. Some more planes went over, headed east, after the other. There might have been 2 or more, he could not tell. But they were travelling very fast, with their jets shrieking. The next day, Comrade Baltinov was missing. There had been a lot of trouble, but in the end it was decided that Baltinov must have been working alone. So it had all passed off safely for Fedor. He had cautiously waited for a year before he made a move. It had cost him almost the last of his rubles by the time he had bought his way through the final obstacles. Then he had had to take various jobs to live, so that he had spent a long time in reaching England. But now he had. Could he have some money, please? Something had been heard about Elovsk by that time, and the date he gave for the plane landing was within probability. So they gave him some money. They also gave him a job and told him to keep his mouth shut. For it was clear that though Umberto had not personally delivered the goods, he had at least saved the situation by broadcasting them. Arctic European had not at first connected the appearance of the Triffids with Umberto, and the police of several countries went on keeping an eye open for him on their behalf. It was not until some investigator produced a specimen of Triffid oil for their inspection that they realized that it corresponded exactly with the sample Umberto had showed them, and that it was the seeds of the Triffid he had set out to bring. What happened to Umberto himself will never be definitely known. It is my guess that over the Pacific Ocean, somewhere high up in the stratosphere, he and Comrade Baltinov found themselves attacked by the planes that Fedor had heard in pursuit. It may be that the first they knew of it was when cannon shells from Russian fighters started to break up their craft. And I think, too, that one of those shells blew to pieces a certain 12-inch cube of plywood, the receptacle like a small tea-chest in which, according to Fedor, the seeds were packed. Perhaps Umberto's plane exploded, perhaps it just fell to pieces. Whichever it was, I am sure that when the fragments began their long, long fall towards the sea, they left behind them something which looked at first like a white vapour. It was not vapour. It was a cloud of seeds, floating so infinitely light they were, even in the rarefied air. Millions of gossamer-slung Triffid seeds, free now to drift wherever the winds of the world should take them. It might be weeks, perhaps months before they would sink to earth at last, many of them thousands of miles from their starting place. That is, I repeat, conjecture. But I cannot see a more probable way in which that plant, intended to be kept secret, could come quite suddenly, to be found in almost every part of the world. My introduction to a Triffid came early. It so happened that we had one of the first in the locality growing in our own garden. The plant was quite well developed before any of us bothered to notice it, for it had taken root along with a number of other casuals behind the bit of hedge that screened the rubbish heap. It wasn't doing any harm there, and it wasn't in anyone's way, so when we did notice it later on, we'd just take a look at it now and then to see how it was getting along, and let it be. However, a Triffid is certainly distinctive, and we couldn't help getting a bit curious about it, after a time. Not perhaps very actively, for there are always a few unfamiliar things that somehow or other manage to lodge in the neglected corners of a garden, but enough to mention to one another that it was beginning to look a pretty queer sort of thing. Nowadays, when everyone knows only too well what a Triffid looks like, it is difficult to recall how odd and somehow foreign the first ones appeared to us. Nobody, as far as I know, felt any misgiving or alarm about them then. I imagine that most people thought of them, when they thought of them at all, in much the same way that my father did. I have a picture in my memory of him examining ours and puzzling over it at a time when it must have been about a year old. In almost every detail it was a half-size replica of a fully grown Triffid, only it didn't have a name yet, and no one had seen one fully grown. My father leant over, peering at it through his horn-rimmed glasses, fingering its stalk, and blowing gently through his gingery moustache, as was his habit when thoughtful. He inspected the straight stem and the woody bole from which it sprang. He gave curious, if not very penetrative attention to the 3 small bare sticks which grew straight up beside the stem. He smoothed the short sprays of leathery green leaves between his finger and thumb as if their texture might tell him something. Then he peered into the curious funnel-like formation at the top of the stem, still puffing reflectively, but inconclusively, through his moustache. I remember the first time he lifted me up to look inside that conical cup and see the tightly wrapped wall within. It looked not unlike the new, close-rolled frond of a fern, emerging a couple of inches from a sticky mess in the base of the cup. I did not touch it, but I knew the stuff must be sticky because there were flies and other small insects struggling in it. More than once my father ruminated that it was pretty queer, and observed that one of these days he really must try and find out what it was. I don't think he ever made the effort, nor at that stage was he likely to have learned much if he had tried. The thing would be about 4 feet high, then. There must have been plenty of them about, growing up quietly and inoffensively with nobody taking any particular notice of them. At least it seemed so, for if the biological or botanical experts were excited over them, no news of their interest percolated to the general public. And so the one in our garden continued its growth peacefully, as did thousands like it, in neglected spots all over the world. It was some little time later that the first one picked up its roots and walked. That improbable achievement must, of course, have been known for some time in Russia, where it was doubtless classified as a state secret. But as far as I have been able to confirm, its first occurrence in the outside world took place in Indochina, which meant that people went on taking practically no notice. Indochina was one of those regions from which such curious and unlikely yarns might be expected to drift in, and frequently did, the kind of thing an editor might conceivably use if news were scarce and a touch of the mysterious East would liven the paper up a bit. But in any case, the Indo-Chinese specimen can have had no great lead. Within a few weeks, reports of walking plants were pouring in from Sumatra, Borneo, the Belgian Congo, Colombia, Brazil, and most places in the neighbourhood of the equator. This time they got into print all right. But the much-handled stories, written up with that blend of cautiously defensive frivolity which the press habitually employed to cover themselves in matters regarding sea serpents, elementals, thought transference, and other irregular phenomena, prevented anyone from realizing that these accomplished plants at all resembled the quiet, respectable weed beside our rubbish heap. Not until the pictures began to appear did we realize that they were identical with it, save in size. The newsreel men were quickly off the mark. Possibly they got some good and interesting pictures for their trouble of flying to outlandish places, but there was a current theory among cutters that more than a few seconds of any one news subject, except a boxing match, could not fail to paralyze an audience with boredom. My first view, therefore, of a development which was to play such an important part in my future, as well as in so many other people's, was a glimpse sandwiched between a hula contest in Honolulu and the First Lady launching a battleship. But that is no anachronism. They were still building them. Even admirals had to live. I was permitted to see a few Triffids sway across the screen, to the kind of accompaniment supposed to be on the level of the great movie-going public.
And now, folks, get a load of what our cameraman found in Ecuador. Vegetables on vacation. You've only seen this kind of thing after a party, but down in sunny Ecuador they see it any time, and no hangover to follow. Monster plants on the march. Say, that's given me a big idea. Maybe if we can educate our potatoes right, we can fix it so they'll walk right into the pot. How'd that be, Mama?
For the short time the scene was on, I stared at it fascinated. There was our mysterious rubbish heap plant grown to a height of 7 feet or more. There was no mistaking it. And it was walking. The bowl, which I now saw for the first time, was shaggy with little rootlet hairs. It would have been almost spherical but for 3 bluntly tapered projections extending from the lower part. Supported on these, the main body was lifted about a foot clear of the ground. When it walked, it moved rather like a man on crutches. 2 of the blunt legs slid forward, then the whole thing lurched as the rear one drew almost level with them, then the 2 in front slid forward again. At each step, the long stem whipped violently back and forth. It gave one a kind of seasick feeling to watch it. As a method of progress, it looked both strenuous and clumsy, faintly reminiscent of young elephants at play. One felt that if it were to go on lurching for long in that fashion, it would be bound to strip all its leaves if it did not actually break its stem. Nevertheless, ungainly though it looked, it was contriving to cover the ground at something like an average walking pace. That was about all I had time to see before the battleship launching began. It was not a lot, but it was enough to incite an investigating spirit in a boy. For if that thing in Ecuador could do a trick like that, why not the one in our garden? Admittedly, ours was a good deal smaller, but it did look the same. About 10 minutes after I got home, I was digging round our Triffid, carefully loosening the earth near it to encourage it to walk. Unfortunately, there was an aspect of this self-propelled plant discovery which the newsreel people had either not experienced, or had chosen for some reason of their own not to reveal. There was no warning either. I was bending down, intent on clearing the earth without harming the plant, when something from nowhere hit me one terrific slam, and knocked me out. I woke up to find myself in bed, with my mother, my father, and the doctor watching me anxiously. My head felt as if it was split open. I was aching all over, and as I later discovered, one side of my face was decorated with a blotchy red raised wheal. The insistent questions as to how I came to be lying unconscious in the garden were quite useless. I had no faintest idea what it was that had hit me. And some little time passed before I learned that I must have been one of the first persons in England to be stung by a Triffid, and get away with it. The Triffid was, of course, immature. But before I had fully recovered, my father had found out what had undoubtedly happened to me, and by the time I went into the garden again, he had wreaked stern vengeance on our Triffid, and disposed of the remains on a bonfire. Now that walking plants were established facts, the press lost its former tepidity and bathed them in publicity. So a name had to be found for them. Already there were botanists wallowing after their custom in polysyllabic dog Latin and Greek to produce variants on ambulans and pseudopodia. But what the newspapers and the public wanted was something easy on the tongue and not too heavy on the headlines for general use. If you could see the papers of that time, you would find them referring to tricots, tricusps, trigenates, trigons, trilogs, tridentates, trinits, tripedals, tripeds, trichets, tripods, tripits, and a number of other mysterious things not even beginning with tri, though almost all centred on the feature of that active three-pronged root. There was argument, public, private, and bar parlour with heated championship of one term or another on near-scientific, quasi-etymological, and a number of other grounds, but gradually one term began to dominate this philological gymkhana, In its first form it was not quite acceptable, but common usage modified the original long first I, and custom quickly wrote in a second F, to leave no doubt about it. And so emerged the standard term. A catchy little name originating in some newspaper office as a handy label for an oddity, but destined one day to be associated with pain, fear, and misery. Triffid. The first wave of public interest soon ebbed away. Triffids were admittedly a bit weird, but that was, after all, just because they were novelties. People had felt the same about novelties of other days, about kangaroos, giant lizards, black swans. And when you came to think of it, were Triffids all that much queerer than mudfish, ostriches, tadpoles, and 100 other things? The bat was an animal that had learned to fly. Well, here was a plant that had learned to walk. What of that? But there were features of it to be less casually dismissed. On its origins, the Russians, true to type, lay low and said nothing. Even those who had heard of Umberto did not yet connect him with it. Its sudden appearance, and even more its wide distribution, prompted very puzzled speculation. For though it matured more rapidly in the tropics, specimens in various stages of development were reported from almost any region outside the polar circles and the deserts. People were surprised, and a little disgusted, to learn that the species was carnivorous, and that the flies and other insects caught in the cups were actually digested by the sticky substance there. We in temperate zones were not ignorant of insectivorous plants, but we were unaccustomed to find them outside special hothouses, and apt to consider them as in some way slightly indecent, or at least improper. But actually alarming was the discovery that the whorl topping a Triffid stem could lash out as a slender stinging weapon 10 feet long, capable of discharging enough poison to kill a man if it struck squarely on his unprotected skin. As soon as this danger was appreciated, there followed a nervous smashing and chopping of Triffids everywhere, until it occurred to someone that all that was necessary to make them harmless was the removal of the actual stinging weapon. At this, the slightly hysterical assault upon the plants declined, with their numbers considerably thinned. A little later, it began to be a fashion to have a safely docked Triffid or two about one's garden. It was found that it took about 2 years for the lost sting to be dangerously replaced, so that an annual pruning assured that they were in a state of safety where they could provide vast amusement for the children. In temperate countries, where man had succeeded in putting most forms of nature save his own under a reasonable degree of restraint, the status of the Triffid was thus made quite clear. But in the tropics, particularly in the dense forest areas, they quickly became a scourge. The traveller very easily failed to notice one among the normal bushes and undergrowth, and the moment he was in range the venomous sting would slash out. Even the regular inhabitant of such a district found it difficult to detect a motionless Triffid cunningly lurking beside a jungle path. They were uncannily sensitive to any movement near them, and it was hard to take them unawares. Dealing with them became a serious problem in such regions. The most favoured method was to shoot the top off the stem and the sting with it. The jungle natives took to carrying long, light poles mounted with hooked knives, which they used effectively if they could get their blows in first. But not at all, if the Triffid had a chance to sway forward and increase its range by an unexpected 4 or 5 feet. Before long, however, these pike-like devices were mostly superseded by spring-operated guns of various types. Most of them shot spinning discs, crosses, or small boomerangs of thin steel. As a rule, they were inaccurate above about 12 yards, though capable of slicing a Triffid stem neatly at 25 if they hit it. Their invention pleased both the authorities, who had an almost unanimous distaste for the indiscriminate toting of rifles, and the users, who found the missiles of razor-blade steel far cheaper and lighter than cartridges, and admirably adaptable to silent banditry. Elsewhere, immense research into the nature, habits, and constitution of the Triffid went on. Earnest experimenters set out to determine in the interests of science how far and for how long it could walk, whether it could be said to have a front, or could perform its march in any direction with equal clumsiness, what proportion of its time it must spend with its roots in the ground, what reactions it showed to the presence of various chemicals in the soil, and a vast quantity of other questions, both useful and useless. The largest specimen ever observed in the tropics stood nearly 10 feet high. No European specimen over 8 feet had been seen, and the average was a little over 7. They appeared to adapt easily to a wide range of climate and soils. They had, it seemed, no natural enemies, other than man. But there were a number of not unobvious characteristics which escaped comment for some little time. It was, for instance, quite a while before anyone drew attention to the uncanny accuracy with which they aimed their stings, and that they almost invariably struck for the head. Nor did anyone at first take notice of their habit of lurking near their fallen victims. The reason for that only became clear when it was shown that they fed upon flesh, as well as upon insects. The stinging tendril did not have the muscular power to tear firm flesh, but it had strength enough to pull shreds from a decomposing body and lift them to the cup on its stem. There was no great interest either in the 3 little leafless sticks at the base of the stem. There was a light notion that they might have something to do with the reproductive system, that system which tends to be a sort of botanical glory hole for all parts of doubtful purpose until they can be sorted out and more specifically assigned later on. It was assumed, consequently, that their characteristic of suddenly losing their immobility and rattling a rapid tattoo against the main stem was some strange form of Triffidian amatory exuberance. Possibly my uncomfortable distinction of getting myself stung so early in the Triffid era had the effect of stimulating my interest, for I seemed to have a sort of link with them from then on. I spent, or wasted if you look at me through my father's eyes, a great deal of fascinated time watching them. One could not blame him for considering this a worthless pursuit, yet later the time turned out to have been better employed than either of us suspected, for it was just before I left school that the Arctic and European Fish Oil Company reconstituted itself, dropping the word fish in the process. The public learned that it and similar companies in other countries were about to farm Triffids on a large scale in order to extract valuable oils and juices, and to press highly nutritious oil cake for stock feeding. Consequently, Triffids moved into the realm of big business overnight. Right away I decided my future. I applied to the Arctic and European, where my qualifications got me a job in the production side. My father's disapproval was somewhat qualified by the rate of pay, which was good for my age. But when I spoke enthusiastically of the future, he blew doubtfully through his moustache. He had real faith only in a type of work steadied by long tradition, but he let me have my way. "After all, if the thing isn't a success, you'll find out young enough to start in on something more solid," he conceded. There turned out to be no need for that. Before he and my mother were killed together in a holiday Airbus crash 5 years later, they had seen the new companies drive all competing oils off the market, and those of us who had been in at the beginning, apparently well set for life. One of the early comers was my friend Walter Luckner. There had been some doubt at first about taking Walter on. He knew little of agriculture, less of business, and lacked the qualifications for lab work. On the other hand, he did know a lot about Triffids. He had a kind of inspired knack with them. What happened to Walter that fatal May years later I do not know, though I can guess. It is a sad thing that he did not escape. He might have been immensely valuable later on. I don't think anybody really understands Triffids, or ever will. But Walter came nearer to beginning to understand them than any man I have ever known. Or should I say that he was given to intuitive feelings about them? It was a year or two after the job had begun that he first surprised me. The sun was close to setting. We had knocked off for the day and were looking with a sense of satisfaction at 3 new fields of nearly fully grown Triffids. In those days we didn't simply corral them as we did later. They were arranged across the fields roughly in rows. At least the steel stakes to which each was tethered by a chain were in rows, though the plants themselves had no sense of tidy regimentation. We reckoned that in another month or so we'd be able to start tapping them for juice. The evening was peaceful. Almost the only sounds that broke it were the occasional rattling of the Triffids' little sticks against their stems. Walter regarded them with his head slightly on one side. He removed his pipe. "Tonight?" he observed. I took that as anyone else would, metaphorically. "Maybe it's the weather," I suggested. I fancy they do it more when it's dry. He looked sidelong at me with a smile. Do you talk more when it's dry? Why should... I began, and then broke off. You don't really mean you think they're talking, I said, noticing his expression. Well, why not? But it's absurd, plants talking. So much more absurd than plants walking, he asked. I stared at them, and then back at him. I never thought, I began doubtfully. You try thinking of it a bit and watching them. I'd be interested to hear your conclusions, he said. It was a curious thing that in all my dealings with Triffids such a possibility had never occurred to me. I'd been prejudiced, I suppose, by the love call theory. But once he had put the idea into my mind, it stuck. I couldn't get away from the fact that they might indeed be rattling out secret messages to one another. Up to then I'd fancied I'd watched Triffids pretty closely, but when Walter was talking about them, I felt that I'd noticed practically nothing. He could, when he was in the mood, talk on about them for hours, advancing theories that were sometimes wild, but sometimes not impossible. The public had by this time grown out of thinking Triffids freakish. They were clumsily amusing, but not greatly interesting. The company found them interesting, however. It took the view that their existence was a piece of benevolence for everyone, particularly for itself. Walter shared neither view. At times, listening to him, I began to have some misgivings myself. He had become quite certain that they talked. And that, he argued, means that somewhere in them is intelligence. It can't be seated in a brain, because dissection shows nothing like a brain, but that doesn't prove there isn't something there that does a brain's job. And there's certainly intelligence there of a kind. Have you noticed that when they attack they always go for the unprotected parts? Almost always the head, but sometimes the hands. And another thing, if you look at the statistics of casualties, just take notice of the proportion that has been stung across the eyes and blinded. It's remarkable. And significant. Of what? I asked. Of the fact that they know what is the surest way to put a man out of action. In other words, they know what they're doing. Look at it this way. Granted that they do have intelligence, then that would leave us with only one important superiority. Sight. We can see and they can't. Take away our vision, and the superiority is gone. Worse than that, our position becomes inferior to theirs because they are adapted to a sightless existence and we are not. But even if that were so, they can't do things, they can't handle things. There's very little muscular strength in that sting lash, I pointed out. Well, true. But what's the good of our ability to handle things if we can't see what to do with them? Anyway, they don't need to handle things, not in the way we do. They can get their nourishment direct from the soil or from insects and bits of raw meat. They don't have to go through all the complicated business of growing things, distributing them, and they're usually cooking them as well. In fact, if it were a choice for survival between a Triffid and a blind man, I know which I'd put my money on. You're assuming equal intelligence, I said. Not at all. I don't need to. I should imagine it's likely to be an altogether different type of intelligence, if only because their needs are so much simpler. Look at the complex processes we have to use to get an assimilable extract from a Triffid. Now, reverse that. What does the Triffid have to do? Just sting us, wait a few days, and then begin to assimilate us. The simple, natural course of things. He would go on like that by the hour, until listening to him would have me getting things out of proportion, and I'd find myself thinking of the Triffids as though they were some kind of competitor. Walter himself never pretended to think otherwise. He had, he admitted, thought of writing a book on that very aspect of the subject when he had gathered more material. Had? I repeated. What's stopping you? Just this. He waved his hand to include the farm generally. It's a vested interest now. It wouldn't pay anyone to put out disturbing thoughts about it. Anyway, we have the Triffids controlled well enough, so it's an academic point and scarcely worth raising. I never can be quite sure with you, I told him. I'm never certain how far you're serious and how far beyond your facts you allow your imagination to lead you. Do you honestly think there is a danger in the things? He puffed a bit at his pipe before he answered. That's fair enough, he admitted. Because, well, I'm by no means sure myself. But I'm pretty certain of one thing, and that is that there could be danger in them. I'd feel a lot nearer giving you a real answer if I could get a line on what it means when they patter. Somehow I don't care for that. There they sit, with everyone thinking no more of them than they might be a pretty odd lot of cabbages. Yet half the time they're pattering and clattering away at one another. Why? What is it they patter about? That's what I want to know. I think Walter rarely gave a hint of his ideas to anyone else, and I kept them confidential partly because I knew no one who wouldn't be more sceptical than I was myself, and partly because it wouldn't do either of us any good to get a reputation in the firm as crackpots. For a year or so more we were working fairly close together. But with the opening of new nurseries and the need for studying methods abroad, I began to travel a lot. He gave up fieldwork and went into the research department. It suited him there, doing his own research as well as the company's. I used to drop in to see him from time to time. He was forever making experiments with his Triffids, but the results weren't clearing his general ideas as much as he had hoped. He had proved, to his own satisfaction at least, the existence of a well-developed intelligence. And even I had to admit that his results seemed to show something more than instinct. He was still convinced that the pattering of the sticks was a form of communication. For public consumption he had shown that the sticks were something more, and that a Triffid deprived of them gradually deteriorated. He had also established that the infertility rate of Triffid seeds was something like 95%. Which, he remarked, is a damn good thing. If they all germinated, there'd soon be standing room only for Triffids only on this planet. With that, too, I agreed. Triffid seed time was quite a sight. The dark green pod just below the cup was glistening and distended, about half as big again as a large apple. When it burst, it did it with a pop that was audible 20 yards away. The white seeds shot into the air like steam and began drifting away on the lightest of breezes. Looking down on a field of Triffids late in August, you could well get the idea that some kind of desultory bombardment was in progress. It was Walter's discovery again that the quality of the extracts was improved if the plants retained their stings. In consequence, the practice of docking was discontinued on farms throughout the trade, and we had to wear protective devices when working among the plants. At the time of the accident that had landed me in hospital, I was actually with Walter. We were examining some specimens which were showing unusual deviations. Both of us were wearing wire mesh masks. I did not see exactly what happened. All I know is that as I bent forward, a sting slashed viciously at my face and smacked against the wire of the mask. 99 times in 100 it would not have mattered. That was what the masks were for. But this one came with such force that some of the little poison sacs were burst open, and a few drops from them went into my eyes. Walter got me back into his lab and administered the antidote in a few seconds. It was entirely due to his quick work that they had the chance of saving my sight at all. But even so, it had meant over a week in bed, in the dark. While I lay there, I had quite decided that when, and if, I had my sight back, I was going to apply for a transfer to another side of the business. And if that did not go through, I'd quit the job altogether. I had built up a considerable resistance to Triffid poison since my first sting in the garden. I could take, and had taken, without very much harm, stings which would have laid an inexperienced man out very cold indeed. But an old saying about a pitcher and a well kept on recurring to me. I was taking my warning. I spent, I remember, a good many of my enforcedly dark hours deciding what kind of job I would try for if they would not give me that transfer. Considering what was just around the corner for us all, I could scarcely have found a contemplation more idle. Chapter 3. The Groping City. I left the pub door swinging behind me as I made my way to the corner of the main road. There I hesitated. To the left, through miles of suburban streets, lay the open country. To the right, the West End of London, with the city beyond. I was feeling somewhat restored, but curiously detached now, and rudderless. I had no glimmering of a plan, and in the face of what I had at last begun to perceive as a vast, and not merely local, catastrophe, I was still too stunned to begin to reason one out. What plan could there be to deal with such a thing? I felt forlorn, cast into desolation, and yet not quite real, not quite myself, here and now. In no direction was there any traffic nor any sound of it. The only signs of life were a few people here and there cautiously groping their ways along the shop fronts. The day was perfect for early summer. The sun poured down from a deep blue sky set with tufts of white woolly clouds. All of it was clean and fresh, save for a smear made by a single column of greasy smoke coming from somewhere behind the houses to the north. I stood there indecisively for a few minutes. Then I turned east, Londonwards. To this day I cannot quite say why. Perhaps it was an instinct to seek familiar places, or the feeling that if there were authority anywhere it must be somewhere in that direction. The brandy had made me more hungry than ever, but I did not find the problem of feeding as easy to deal with as it should have been. And yet, there were the shops, untenanted and unguarded, with food in the windows. And here was I, with hunger, and the means to pay, or if I did not wish to pay, I had only to smash a window and take what I wanted. Nevertheless, it was hard to persuade oneself to do that. I was not yet ready to admit, after nearly 30 years of a reasonably right-respecting existence and law-abiding life, that things had changed in any fundamental way. There was, too, a feeling that as long as I remained my normal self, things might even yet in some inconceivable way return to their normal. Absurd it undoubtedly was. But I had a very strong sense that the moment I stove in one of those sheets of plate glass, I should leave the old order behind me forever. I should become a looter, a sacker, a low scavenger upon the dead body of the system that had nourished me. Such a foolish niceness of sensibility in a stricken world. And yet it still pleases me to remember that civilized usage did not slide off me at once, and that for a time at least I wandered along past displays which made my mouth water while my already obsolete conventions kept me hungry. The problem resolved itself in a sophistical way after perhaps half a mile. A taxi, after mounting the pavement, had finished up with its radiator buried in a pile of delicatessen. That made it seem different from doing my own breaking in. I climbed past the taxi and collected the makings of a good meal. But even then, something of the old standard still clung. I conscientiously left a fair price for what I had taken, lying on the counter. Almost across the road there was a garden. It was the kind that had once been the graveyard of a vanished church. The old headstones had been taken up and set back against the surrounding brick wall, the clear space turfed over and laid out with gravelled paths. It looked pleasant under the freshly leafed trees, and to one of the seats there I took my lunch. The place was withdrawn and peaceful. No one else came in, though occasionally a figure would shuffle past the railings at the entrance. I threw some crumbs to a few sparrows, the first birds I had seen that day, and felt all the better for watching their perky indifference to calamity. When I had finished eating, I lit a cigarette. While I sat there smoking it, wondering where I should go and what I should do, the quiet was broken by the sound of a piano played somewhere in a block of apartments that overlooked the garden. Presently a girl's voice began to sing. The song was Byron's ballad. So we'll go no more a-roving so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving, and the moon be still as bright. For the sword outwears its sheath, and the soul wears out the breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, and love itself have rest. Though the night was made for loving, and the day returns too soon, yet we'll go no more a-roving by the light of the moon. I listened, looking up at the pattern that the tender young leaves and the branches made against the fresh blue sky. The song finished. The notes of the piano died away. Then there was a sound of sobbing. No passion. Softly, helplessly, forlorn, heartbroken. Who she was, whether it was the singer or another weeping her hopes away, I do not know. But to listen longer was more than I could endure. I went quietly back into the street, seeing it only mistily for a while. Even Hyde Park Corner, when I reached it, was almost deserted. A few derelict cars and lorries stood about on the roads. Very little, it seemed, had gone out of control when it was in motion. One bus had run across the path and come to rest in the Green Park. A runaway horse with shafts still attached to it lay beside the artillery memorial against which it had cracked its skull. The only moving things were a few men, and a lesser number of women feeling their way carefully with hands and feet where there were railings, and effectively outstretched arms where there were not. Also, and rather unexpectedly, there were one or two cats, apparently intact visually, and treating the whole situation with that self-possession common to cats. They had poor luck prowling through the eerie quietness. The sparrows were few, and the pigeons had vanished. Still magnetically drawn towards the old centre of things, I crossed in the direction of Piccadilly. I was just about to start along it when I noticed a sharp new sound, a steady tapping not far away, and coming closer. Looking up Park Lane, I discovered its source. A man, more neatly dressed than any other I had seen that morning, was walking rapidly towards me, hitting the wall beside him with a white stick. As he caught the sound of my steps, he stopped, listening alertly. "It's all right," I told him. "Come on." I felt relieved to see him. He was, so to speak, normally blind. His dark glasses were much less disturbing than the staring but useless eyes of the others. "Stand still, then," he said. "I've already been bumped into by God knows how many fools today. What the devil's happened? Why is it so quiet? I know it isn't night. I can feel the sunlight. What's gone wrong with everything?" I told him as much as I knew. When I had finished, he said nothing for almost a minute. Then he gave a short, bitter laugh. "There's one thing," he said. "They'll be needing all their damned patronage for themselves now." With that he straightened up, a little defiantly. "Thank you. Good luck," he said to me, and set off westwards wearing an exaggerated air of independence. The sound of his briskly confident tapping gradually died away behind me as I made my way up Piccadilly. There were more people to be seen now, and I walked among the scatter of stranded vehicles in the road. Out there I was much less disturbing to the people feeling their way along the fronts of the buildings, for every time they heard a step close by they would stop and brace themselves against a possible collision. Such collisions were taking place every now and then all down the street, but there was one that I found significant. The subjects of it had been groping along a shop front from opposite directions until they met with a bump. One was a young man in a well-cut suit, but wearing a tie obviously selected by touch alone. The other a woman who carried a small child. The child whined something inaudible. The young man had started to edge his way past the woman. He stopped abruptly. "Wait a minute," he said. "Can your child see?" "Yes," she said, "but I can't." The young man turned. He put one finger on the plate-glass window, pointing. "Look, Sonny, what's in there?" he asked. "Not Sonny," the child objected. "Go on, Mary, tell the gentleman," her mother encouraged her. "Pretty ladies," said the child. The man took the woman by the arm and felt his way to the next window. "And what's in here?" he asked again. "Apples and things," the child told him. "Fine," said the young man. He pulled off his shoe and hit the window a smart smack with the heel of it. He was inexperienced. The first blow did not do it, but the second did. The crash reverberated up and down the street. He restored his shoe, put an arm cautiously through the broken window, and felt about until he found a couple of oranges. One he gave to the woman, and one to the child. He felt about again, found one for himself, and began to peel it. The woman fingered hers. "But," she began. "What's the matter? Don't like oranges?" he asked. "But it isn't right," she said. "We didn't ought to take 'em, not like this." "How else are you going to get food?" he inquired. "I suppose—" "Well, I don't know," she admitted doubtfully. "Very well, that's the answer. Eat it up now, and we'll go and find something more substantial." She still held the orange in her hand, head bent down as though she were looking at it. "All the same, don't seem right," she said again, but there was less conviction in her tone. Presently she put the child down, and began to peel the orange. Piccadilly Circus was the most populous place I had found so far. It seemed crowded after the rest, though there were probably less than 100 people there, all told. Mostly they were wearing queer, ill-assorted clothes, and were prowling restlessly around as though still semi-dazed. Occasionally a mishap would bring an outburst of profanity and futile rage, rather alarming to hear because it was itself the product of fright and childish in temper. But with one exception, there was little talk and little noise. It seemed as though their blindness had shut people into themselves. The exception had found himself a position out on one of the traffic islands. He was a tall, elderly, gaunt man with a bush of wiry grey hair, and he was holding forth emphatically about repentance, the wrath to come, and the uncomfortable prospects for sinners. Nobody was paying him any attention. For most of them, the day of wrath had already arrived. Then, from a distance, came a sound which caught everyone's attention, a gradually swelling chorus. "And when I die, don't bury me at all, just pickle my bones in alcohol." Dreary and untuneful it slurred through the empty streets, echoing dismally back and forth. Every head in the circus was turning now left, now right, trying to place its direction. The prophet of doom raised his voice against the competition. The song wailed discordantly closer. "Put a bottle of booze at my head and my feet, and then, I'm sure, my bones will keep." And as an accompaniment to it there was the shuffle of feet more or less in step. From where I stood I could see them come in single file out of a side street into Shaftesbury Avenue, and turn towards the circus. The second man had his hands on the shoulders of the leader, the third on his, and so on to the number of 25 or 30. At the conclusion of that song somebody started "Beer, beer, glorious beer," pitching it in such a high key that it petered out in confusion. They trudged steadily on until they reached the centre of the circus. Then the leader raised his voice. It was a considerable voice, with parade ground quality. "Company, ho!" Everybody else in the circus was now struck motionless, all with their faces turned towards him, all trying to guess what was afoot. The leader raised his voice again, mimicking the manner of a professional guide. "Here we are, gents, one and all, pick up bloody dilly circus, the centre of the world, the hub of the universe, where all the knobs had their wine, women, and song." He was not blind. Far from it. His eyes were ranging round, taking stock as he spoke. His sight must have been saved by some such accident as mine. But he was pretty drunk, and so were the men behind him. "And we'll have it too," he added. "Next stop, the well-known Café Royal, and all drinks on the house." "Yes, but what about the women?" asked a voice, and there was a laugh. "Oh, women, say what you want," said the leader. He stepped forward and caught a girl by the arm. She screamed as he dragged her towards the man who had spoken, but he took no notice of that. "There you are, chump, and don't say I don't treat you right. It's a peach, a smasher, if that makes any difference to you." "Hey, what about me?" said the next man. "You, mate. What do you see? Like I'm blonde or dark?" Considered later, I suppose I behaved like a fool. My head was still full of standards and conventions that had ceased to apply. It did not occur to me that if there was to be any survive, anyone adopted by this gang would stand a far better chance than she would on her own. Fired with a mixture of schoolboy heroics and noble sentiments, I waded in. He didn't see me coming until I was quite close, and then I slogged for his jaw. Unfortunately, he was a little quicker. When I next took an interest in things, I found myself lying in the road. The sound of the gang was diminishing into the distance, and the prophet of doom, restored to eloquence, was sending threatful bolts of damnation, hellfire, and a brimstone Gehenna hurtling after them. With a bit of sense knocked into me, I became thankful that the affair had not fallen out worse. Had the result been reversed, I could scarcely have escaped making myself responsible for the men he had been leading. After all, and whatever one might feel about his methods, he was the eyes of that party, and they'd be looking to him for food as well as for drink. And the women would go along too, on their own account as soon as they got hungry enough. And now I came to look around me, I felt doubtful whether any of the women hereabouts would seriously mind anyway. What with one thing and another, It looked as if I might have had a lucky escape from promotion to gang leadership. Remembering that they had been headed for the Café Royal, I decided to revive myself and clear my head at the Regent Palace Hotel. Others appeared to have thought of that before me, but there were quite a lot of bottles they had not found. I think it was while I was sitting there comfortably with a brandy in front of me and a cigarette in my hand that I at last began to admit that what I had seen was all real and decisive. There would be no going back, ever. It was finish to all I had known. Perhaps it had needed that blow to drive it home. Now I came face to face with the fact that my existence simply had no focus any longer. My way of life, my plans, ambitions, every expectation I had had, they were all wiped out at a stroke, along with the conditions that had formed them. I suppose that had I had any relatives or close attachments to mourn, I should have felt suicidally derelict at that moment. But what had seemed at times a rather empty existence turned out now to be lucky. My mother and father were dead. My one attempt to marry had miscarried some years before, and there was no particular person dependent on me. And, curiously, what I found that I did feel, with a consciousness that it was against what I ought to be feeling, was release. It wasn't just the brandy, for it persisted. I think it may have come from the sense of facing something quite fresh and new to me. All the old problems, the stale ones, both personal and general, had been solved by one mighty slash. Heaven alone knew as yet what others might arise, and it looked as though there would be plenty of them. But they would be new. I was emerging as my own master, and no longer a cog. It might well be a world full of horrors and dangers that I should have to face, but I could take my own steps to deal with it. I would no longer be shoved hither and thither by forces and interests that I neither understood nor cared about. No, it wasn't altogether the brandy, for even now, years afterwards, I can still feel something of it, though possibly the brandy did oversimplify things a little just then. Then there was, too, the little question of what to do next, how and where to start on this new life. But I did not let that worry me a lot for the present. I drank up, and went out of the hotel to see what this strange world had to offer. Chapter 4. Shadows Before. In order to give a reasonable berth to the Café Royal mob, I struck up a side street into Soho, intending to cut back to Regent Street higher up. Perhaps hunger was driving more people out of their homes. Whatever the reason, I found that the parts I now entered were more populous than any I'd seen since I left the hospital. Constant collisions took place on the pavements and in the narrow streets, and the confusion of those who were trying to get along was made worse by knots of people clustering in front of the now frequently broken shop windows. None of those who crowded there seemed to be quite sure what kind of shop they were facing. Some in the front sought to find out by groping for any recognizable objects, others, taking the risk of disemboweling themselves on standing splinters of glass, more enterprisingly climbed inside. I felt that I ought to be showing these people where to find food. But should I? If I were to lead them to a food shop still intact, there would be a crowd which would not only have swept the place bare in 5 minutes, but have crushed a number of its weaker members in the process. Soon, anyway, all the food would be gone. Then what was to be done with the thousands clamouring for more? One might collect a small party and keep it alive somehow for an uncertain length of time. But who was to be taken? And who left? No obviously right course presented itself, however I tried to look at it. What was going on was a grim business without chivalry, with no give and all take about it. A man bumping into another and feeling that he carried a parcel would snatch it and duck away on the chance that it contained something to eat, while the loser clutched furiously at the air, or hit out indiscriminately. Once I had to step hurriedly aside to avoid being knocked down by an elderly man who darted into the roadway with no care for possible obstacles. His expression was vastly cunning, and he clutched avariciously to his chest 2 cans of red paint. On a corner, my way was blocked by a group almost weeping with frustration over a bewildered child who could see, but was just too young to understand what they wanted of it. I began to become uneasy. Fighting with my civilized urge to be of some help to these people was an instinct that told me to keep clear. They were already fast losing ordinary restraints. I felt, too, an irrational sense of guilt at being able to see while they could not. It gave me an odd feeling that I was hiding from them, even while I moved among them. Later on, I found how right the instinct was. Close to Golden Square, I began to think of turning left and working back to Regent Street, where the wider roadway would offer easier going. I was about to take a corner that would lead me that way when a sudden piercing scream stopped me. It stopped everyone else, too. All along the street they stood still, turning their heads this way and that, apprehensively trying to guess what was happening. The alarm coming on top of their distress and nervous tension started a number of the women whimpering. The men's nerves weren't in any too good a state either. They showed it mostly in short curses at being startled. For it was an ominous sound, one of the kind of things they had been subconsciously expecting. They waited for it to come again. It did, frightened, and dying into a gasp, but less alarming now that one was ready for it. This time I was able to place it. A few steps took me to an alley entrance. As I turned the corner, a cry that was half a gasp came again. The cause of it was a few yards down the alley. A girl was crouched on the ground while a burly man laid into her with a thin brass rod. The back of her dress was torn, and the flesh beneath showed red wheals. As I came closer, I saw why she did not run away. Her hands were tied together behind her back, and a cord tethered them to the man's left wrist. I reached the pair as his arm was raised for another stroke. It was easy to snatch the rod from his unexpecting hand and bring it down with some force upon his shoulder. He promptly lashed a heavy boot out in my direction, but I had dodged back quickly, and his radius of action was limited by the cord on his wrist. He made another swiping kick at the air while I was feeling in my pocket for a knife. Finding nothing there, he turned and kicked the girl for good measure instead. Then he swore at her and pulled on the cord to bring her to her feet. I slapped him on the side of his head, just hard enough to stop him and make it sing for a bit. Somehow I could not bring myself to lay out a blind man, even this type. While he was steadying himself from that, I stooped swiftly and cut the cord which joined them. A slight shove on his chest sent him staggering back, and half turned him so that he lost his bearings. With his freed left hand he let out a fine raking swing. It missed me, but ultimately reached the brick wall. After that he lost interest in pretty well everything but the pain of his cracked knuckles. I helped the girl up, loosed her hands, and led her away down the alley while he was still blistering the air behind us. As we turned into the street, she began to come up out of her daze. She turned a smeary, tear-stained face, and looked up at me. "But you can see," she said, incredulously. "Certainly I can," I told her. "Oh, thank God. Thank God, I thought I was the only one," she said, and burst into tears again. I looked around us. A few yards away there was a pub with a gramophone playing, glasses smashing and a high old time being had by all. A few yards beyond that was a smaller pub, still intact. A good heave with my shoulder broke in the door to the saloon bar. I half carried the girl in and put her in a chair. Then I dismembered another chair and put two of its legs through the handles of the swing doors for the discouragement of further visitors before I turned my attention to the restoratives at the bar. There was no hurry. She sipped at and snuffled over the first drink. I gave her time to get sorted out, twiddling the stem of my glass and listening to the gramophone in the other pub churning out the currently popular, if rather lugubrious, ditty, "My love's locked up in a frigid air and my heart's in a deep-freeze pack. She's gone with a guy I'd not know where, but she wrote that she'd never come back. Now she don't care for me no more, I'm just a one-man frozen store, and it ain't nice to be on ice with my love locked up in a frigid air and my heart in a deep-freeze pack." While I sat, I stole an occasional covert look at the girl. Her clothes, or the remnants of them, were good quality. Her voice was good, too. Probably not stage or movie acquired, for it had not deteriorated under stress. She was blonde, but quite a number of shades sub-platinum.